Hey everyone, welcome back to the channel. You're watching our cloud school where we are talking about different data integration scenarios using ADF, which is Azure Data Factory. Today in this demonstration, we'll talk about data flows with ADF. Before we talk about what is data flow, let's understand the scenario which we'll be implementing with the help of data flow in ADF. So let's say I have a JSON file which contains an object of state, and these states are collection of state name and code. It's going to be array of state names and code, and I would like to insert these object into the state table in my database. So I have the SQL server created in Azure Past SQL Server instance. So this is my SQL Server database instance which I have opened in my local machine as an Azure Data Studio. Now in this database currently I have two tables, organization and record. I would like to add a state table with all the records which are presented right now in that JSON. So how do we do that? With the help of data flow. That is what we are going to look at. So for the demonstration, I'm going to open the ADF, which is this ADF Our Cloud School instance. And here I'll go to the authors tab where we define our pipeline. So in the pipeline, we know that how do we define the pipelines and data set, as we have created these instances many times in our previous demonstration. Now today we are talking about a data flow. Why data flow? Why not simply copy state or copy activity in the pipeline? Because of the structure of our data, what we have in the JSON is object type and it is complex JSON. So dealing with a complex JSON with a copy activity is not going to be a straightforward job, and it requires a bit of complicated logic to be implemented. Whereas if we go ahead with this another terminology or another tool available within the data factory, which is Azure Data Flow, that makes our job easy. Now data flow itself would be able to data flow itself, we would need to use it inside the pipeline. So I'll show you how. So let me just first of all create new pipeline by clicking on new pipeline, and then inside the activities we have the move and transform. So as of now we used to use the copy data activity, but if you look at here we have the data flow activity as well. So data flow activity is basically you can set what is the data flow activity you would like to use right from this drop down, and you can define your data flow activity. So what is data flow activity? A data flow activity defines the flow of your data or the workflow of your data which you may want to implement it in your Azure Data Factory. So the data flow can contain, let's say, selection of the data, then performing some kind of operation, manipulation, joins, aggregation, all those kind of a thing. If you would like to perform on your data, then data flow is the right kind of activity or the tools to use in this ADF instance. So let me go ahead and define a data set, because unless I define a data set I cannot use it here. So there are two options. First, you can create a data set from here, or you can create a data flow from here, or you can create a data flow from this data flow option. Click on new data flow. That will open the canvas to define your data flow. The very first thing, every data flow requires the source. Now you have to define the source from where your data is coming from. So add source, and then as soon as you select add source, it shows you the settings to define your source. Now again you have to define the source. Is it a inline source which you would like to perform your calculation, or is it a source coming from another data set, which is, let's say, SQL Server or Azure SQL, pSQL, or any other source location where your data is there. Now to define the data set, I'm going to click on new data set, and I'll be creating a data set which is of type Azure storage account, because our JSON file is into a storage account. So I'll be selecting the block storage as an option, and after that I'll be selecting the JSON file, because our data is in the JSON file, the file format. Then I'm going to select as in JSON. Next I'm going to we have to give the name to our data set. So data set source JSON, source block JSON, and then link service. So if you do not have any link service, so then you have to create a link service. So link service is the way to provide a connectivity to your data source that will define where is your data set and how do we want to connect it, right, as we know now. So I'm going to use this existing link service which will be able to connect to my source storage account. Now having this link service in place, if I click on this browse button, that will launch or connect to the containers of the storage account, and here are my container. Then inside the input container we have the file which we are looking for to use in this demonstration. So this is the bulk state.json file, and that is what we are going to use it. That is it. I'll click on OK, and that will define the data set inside the source settings of my data flow. So data set is created. As you can see that this is the data set which we have just now created. If we want to do further calculation, or if you want to preview the data, then you can click on this preview data specifically on the data source, and you would be able to see all the data. Right now, moving on to the next option, which is the source option. We have the source option in case of you would like to perform any operation on the source data. For an example, the file which you are looking for, instead of a specific file, do you want to search the list of files using any wildcard character, partition of root path? Now what do you want to do with if the files are not found, data capture, which column you would like to store? Now although there are many options available. Now as our data source is of type JSON, so there is a JSON settings option available, which is very important in case if you have a data which is object, and that object represent, or your JSON represent collection of different object, and you want to treat each of the collection item as a different item. So in this case, data form is the property which we should be choosing to array of document, that defines that each array element will represent it as a separate record for your file. Now next is the projection. So projection will basically give the metadata information about your JSON file. So as you can see that our JSON file contains the state as an object, and which is of type complex or array, and then within that state object, if I expand, I have name and code. So depending upon the complexity of your file size, you would be able to see all those hierarchical metadata of your JSON structure. So basically it is displaying the schema of your JSON structure. Next is the optimization column, or next optimization tab, which you can use to perform any kind of a partitioning on the source data. Next you have the inspections, which you can use to again inspect the schema, as in what is the type of data your source file is going to have it. Now finally you have the data preview, which you can preview the data from the source. To preview the data from the source, you have to enable the debug mode on your data flow. So this is the enable debug mode on your data flow. So you click on enable debug toggle button, and that will open the settings, and it will say that it is going to use the integration runtime. So which integration runtime you would like to use for enabling or running your debug mode? So I would say that I'm going to use a Azure managed default integration runtime, and what would be the time window you want to enable this debug mode. So it says that 1 hour, you can change it to 4 hours, and so on. So I'm going to enable this debug mode. It might take a couple of seconds to enable the debug mode. While it is enabling the debug mode, what next we need to do is we need to add further settings to this. We need to apply the further calculation on the source data, and to apply the further calculation on this source data, what we need to do is we can click on this add button, and that will show the list of different activities which can follow after this source. So our debug session is ready now, enabled now. So let me just refresh the data so that we can see the preview of the data which is available at the source location. So our data is previewed now. As the JSON object contains the single property which is state and which is of type array. So array type of property is going to be displayed here. This data preview always displays the data in a flattened structure, so any object type of property will not be displaying the data inside the object, hence it's displayed like this. So actually we can't see any data as such because we have just one object type of property which is of array of the object, and then that is not going to be displayed. So what we want to do next is, using the options, we want to flatten these data like code, and let me just show you code and name. So we would like to have a table as in code and name, and that is what we want to insert as in state table into SQL Server. Now to perform this activity, I'll click on this add new, and with that you have multiple options which you can perform on the source. So you can perform the multiple input output operations like join, splitting, union, lookup. We'll have a look at all these options in our separate demonstration, but for this demonstration or introduction of this data flow, I'm going to use the data formatter option, which is the flatten option. So what we want to do is, we want to flat our complex data into a flat structure, and for that reason I'm using this flatten structure. Right now, as you can see that by default it has selected the incoming stream as a source, because it is the source is the previous step. So previous step it has selected this incoming stream. If you have any other stream already presented, like here for an example or somewhere else, and if you want to change the incoming stream, you can change it from here. Next is the unroll by. It means that choose an array in your data on which you would like to flatten your structure, right? I can have multiple of them. For example, add new column like this, and then based on these columns I could flatten the structure. Let's take an example. As right now I have just this state object, but consider that I would have the country object as an array of countries, then I would have the customers or the organization as an array object sitting parallel to this. Then I may want to, let's say, unroll or flatten based on those three properties, but as of now we just have one property, so we don't need these additional column because we just have one column. And we would say that based on this particular attribute we want to flatten our input JSON. Right now, as we have selected this, so by default the input columns which are going to be displayed as a result of the flatten is going to be displayed here. So by default it is selecting the node which you have selected as an unroll by, but that is what we do not want. So what do we want? We want a state and then name property, or in the code property within the state, to be flattened, like state.name, and I would like to give it the name as in code, right? Or I would say that, let's say, state code, like this. Now to add further columns, you can click on this add new, and you can define the fixed mapping. Like this is a fixed mapping which is mapping this column to this. So if you would like to perform the similar activity, you can click on this fixed mapping. If you would like to have a rule based mapping, for an example, based on certain calculation or rules, if you want to perform that logic to be appear, let's take an example of rule based mapping. Let's say there are two columns, order quantity and the order amount price, and based on that you want to calculate the amount column. So that is a rule based mapping criteria, and which you can define an additional column, call it as an amount, and then you can have a mathematical operation which can calculate the value of amount and calculate the value of quantity and rate, and then it will basically calculate the amount column as is, right? So that's the option for rule based mapping. I'll show you a demonstration later on sometime maybe. So for this demonstration we need another column which is of type fixed mapping, because we don't want any calculation to be performed. So I'll call it as in, by default it's the name is given as in code, we will call it as an state underscore code, and both of them are duplicated, so I'm going to call this as a name. So now you can see that I'm going to derive these columns with these names now. You can call these anything, whatever name you would like to give to your database table, that is what you can call it. I have given the name as in state underscore name state underscore code. You could have called it a name and code as well. So let's click on the optimization options. We don't want any partitioning to be happen, and let's click on the inspection. You can see that at the inspection level now we are not getting any state object here. We are directly getting a flattened structure, flattened schema. This is a schema. So if I click on the input, this is my input. You have the input as an object, which state object which has got these two properties, and output is going to be the flattened structure. Now if you click on the data preview, that should preview the data in the flattened structure, the data structure which we are looking for. So let's wait for this to be refreshed. It will refresh the actual live data from the JSON using the debug mode. And as you can see that we have got all our state data, right, in the flat structure. Now our data is ready because that is the structure we wanted to insert into our table. So I'm going to use a next action item which is supposed to be followed by the flatten. So I'm going to use this time the target destination, which is a sync type, and that is where we have to define our sync dataset. So sync dataset is going to be our SQL Server dataset. So let me just define the SQL Server dataset. As of now, there is a SQL Server dataset already available, but that is pointing to the organization table. And what we want to do is we want to create a new table, because remember in our dataset there is no table represents a state. So going back to the dataset, I'm going to click on new and I'll select the SQL Server database, call it as in SQL state, and then I'll choose the link service. It will be the same SQL Server which we want to use it. Here the table name you cannot select it because there is no table exists. If you have the existing table in which you would like to insert the data, you can select from here, but in our case we would like to use the table dynamically. So I'm not going to select the table right here from this option. Let's click OK. That will create the dataset. As you can see that new SQL state dataset is created, and that has been opted here as well. Now if I'm going to validate this data flow, that will not work because it is not pointing, our sync state is not pointing to any specific table. How? Let me just show you. I'll double click on this DS SQL state, and you can see that here the table selection option is empty. So if I just validate the data state, it will say that please select the table. So which means that I have to provide the table name. Now as I would like to provide the table name dynamically, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to click on this edit option, and here you can specify the name of this DBO, name of the schema, which is DBO in this case, and then here I'm going to call it as in state. These names you can set with the help of the parameters if you would like to, and then pass the parameters from your data flow, and data flow can have the parameter as well, and which can be passed from the pipeline. So there can be chain of parameters which you can provide it right away from one place to other place. Now we have not talked about the parameters. That is something which will look into our separate videos. I don't want to make this video complicated. So consider that this is our SQL state dataset in which we would like to perform the operation on this table. Now what operation we want to perform, that is not defined yet. That we will say that we will configure it in the data flow. So if you click on schema, as we are dynamically want to create a table, so there is no schema which is automatically imported, right? Parameters, again we are not using it. So let's go back to the data flow. Our data set is ready for the sync. So this is, we are in sync setting right now. In the sync we have this data set which we have just now created. If you check this option, it says allow schema drift, which means that right now our state JSON contains only 2 columns, but in case if there are modification to the column, like added new columns or remove the existing columns, or modification in the data type of the column in the JSON, then this option will adjust those modification. So that is why this option is here. Going back to the next option, which is the insert. So this will allow insert to the target table, which is state table, using the data set which we have configured, right? And the rest of the other configurations are like errors, mapping we want to skip the duplicate input column, output column, optimizations, which is a partitioning, inspection, and then finally a data preview. Right now we would not have any data preview because we are dealing with a dynamic table or the table which does not exist right now. So let's validate the data flow right now. If it is validated, yes, it is validated right now, correct. Now as after this our data flow is ready. So just to revise, we are reading a source as in JSON which contains an object. Using the flatten activity, we are converting that object into a flat structure using these input column and the unroll by setting. And once we receive the flat structure, we will pass on that flat structure to the sink, which is a target data set, which is our SQL Server state table, and that table too we are creating as an dynamic table, right? So connection, the table name we have given here, which is not present in our data. Now as our data set is ready, I'll come back to the pipeline option where we have added our data flow activities. Now in this data flow activity, I have to define the flow activity which we want to use it. So let's select the data flow activity which we have created just now. Of course, you have to give a proper name so that you identify what kind of a data activity, what action this data flow it is performing, right? What is the workflow of this data flow? Next is parameters. Like I mentioned previously, if there are parameters which you would have defined to your data flow or to your state file, then that would have been assigned right here from this section. But for now, we are good. There is no parameters to be defined here in this case. So our pipeline is ready. It is using the data flow activity, and the data flow itself is defined here, which is using the certain number of different activities, actions, steps, right, to insert a data into SQL Server from JSON. So let's validate this as well. Our pipeline is validated. Now as we know that we can run the pipeline from this trigger option or from this debug option. You can see that previously we do not use to get this data flow debug option because we are using a data flow in this case and we want to debug this data flow. That's why this toggle button is available here. So let me just click on debug option, and that will debug the pipeline. So here at the output tab, we will get the execution of the data flow pipeline or the data flow activity, which is part of our pipeline. So the pipeline is successfully completed. Now if I click on this lens icon, that will display what exactly the action being performed as part of this data flow. And as the data flow contains the series of actions or activities which are supposed to be performed, so each activities we can have a look at step by step like this. Now to verify the actions what is being performed, you can see that total rows calculated on the SQL Server. That's the result. Now to see the actual result, we can go to the table and we can refresh it here. Let me just refresh it, and you would see that we have this table available. So let me just verify that by running the select top 1000 records on this table. So it has successfully inserted the record which are basically from the state. Now if I rerun the program again or rerun my pipeline again, what happens? Let's look at that. So if I go back again and then try and debug again, so that will rerun the pipeline. So as of now, there are 39 records because those were the number of records which were there in the table, right? So and that is what it has been inserted right now. So let's see what is the outcome of the next subsequent run. So the second run of the pipeline is also completed. Now if I am going to refresh my query, we can see that we have now got double record, which is 39 times 2, 78 records. That has happened because first of all, this state table is dynamically created, which means that we have got two columns and there are no primary key on this column, which means that it can have a duplicate record for the same rows, like same state code. That's first thing. Now how it is happening is because in our data flow activity, if we go back to our sink configuration, in the settings we have allow insert. So what is happening here is, as it is allowing the insert to happen, it is not making a decision on like it's not detecting a duplicate key because of the table design, and is keep on inserting the same record, whatever number of record it's finding on the state table, is keep on inserting one row after row, and that is what it's allowing it to insert. Now obviously we don't want, if we do not want a duplicate record to be inserted, what we want to do is we want to do the upsert thing, right? So if we change this to upsert, then we have to use another operation, which is add alter row operation, which we have to specify on the basis of which column we would like to perform the upsert operation, right? If that is what, and that is what we can do to make sure that we are not inserting a duplicate record, even though your table structure says like that. Obviously your table should have a primary key, and then if that would have been there, and if your pipeline, if you run the pipeline, you would have got the error on the second run saying that you are trying to violate the primary key violation, which is you are trying to insert a duplicate record, right? Now how do we use the upsert? We have seen that with the normal copy data activities or the pipeline within the pipeline, but setting the upsert setting or allow update setting with the data flow is slightly different, which we will have a look at in the separate demonstration when we talk about all these transformation. The transformation which we have used, the flattening transformation, likewise we have, there are number of different type of transformation available, and that is, it is talking about this alter row transformation, right? So that is something we will look into that in the separate demonstration. For now, that is it in this demonstration. So we have learned what is data flow, how do we use data flow to insert a record from a JSON which contains a complex object into a SQL server, how do we define the series of actions, activities inside the data flow, and how you plug the data flow into a pipeline and run or debug your data flow locally before you commit the changes. Of course you can publish these pipelines and you can run it, right? So that is it in this video. I hope you found this video useful. If it is, please give it a thumbs up and do not forget to subscribe to the channel if you haven't already. Thanks for watching it. See you in the next video.